Good evening, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. Mr. Gondani, I'm feeling as if I'm freshly married because you just called me Shoma Anand and gave me away to a man that is not my husband. but that's a celebratory moment. But I'm really delighted and honored to be here to deliver the 2018 Gandhi Oration on the 70th death anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi at UNSW. I gather that I'm possibly the first Indian from India to be doing so I bear a double burden to breathe life into his legacy and memory. But there's another reason why I'm really grateful to have been invited to speak about Gandhi this year. And quite simply, that's because I think we most urgently and pervasively now need him, perhaps more than ever before. Gandhi is not just a savior of our past. He's a diagnostic of our present, a lifeline, a prophet of our future. But if he is to be the potent, living, contemporary force that we need him to be, I believe that, at least metaphorically speaking, we will have to take his bust off the pedestal and look at him in different light. Typically, when we speak of Gandhi, we speak of him in epic and heroic terms. Albert Einstein very famously once said that generations to come will not believe that a man such as this, in flesh and blood, walked upon this earth. He is the man that took down an empire with nonviolence and passive resistance. He is the man who gifted this world the ideas of satyagraha, or soul force, the pursuit of truth, as potent political tools. He is the giant that has impacted other greats like Martin Luther King, Aung San Suu Kyi, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Václav Havel, and many others, the Dalai Lama. But there is a real danger in thinking and speaking of Gandhi only in these exalted terms, because then he loses his meaning and relevance for ordinary people. He seems to be the preserve and domain of others, relevant only in heroic theaters of protest, where extraordinary leaders fighting massive injustices, structures of power, autocratic regimes would follow him at great cost to themselves. For ordinary citizens of modern democracies, he loses his relevance because then he just seems a kind of museum piece, a sort of historic, treasured artifact, but of no real consequence. And satyagraha and nonviolence and ahimsa seem the kind of distant, resistant tools for apartheid and empire and dictatorships. So if Gandhi is to have relevance for us today, we need to, in my opinion, scale him differently. I think we need to scale him down, to bring him down to flesh and blood, to mean something for us. And that is really what today, in my oration, I'd like to do, to bring Gandhi back to us, ordinary people, in the flesh and blood, and understand why he has a significance in this post-truth world. Before I suggest what those new ways of looking at Gandhi can be, there's a question which arises. For both Australians and Indians, as I said, citizens of modern democracies ruled by elected governments, ruled by self-written constitutions, why indeed do we need Gandhi? The answer is really staring at us in the face. 2 years ago, in 2016, the Oxford University Dictionary picked the word post-truth as the most significant of that year. They were bang on point, because we can feel the depravity and impact of that phenomenon all around us. We can feel the noise, the paranoia, the sense of a world gone mad. We have really entered an era where meaning itself is endangered. The most obvious example and manifestation of this across the world is, of course, Donald Trump, who embodies the absurdity, the travesty, the danger, and the demagoguery of a post-truth world. But he's not the reason, he is the symptom. Every country is affected by this. We individually, every one of us, is affected by this. In fact, woefully, all of us are now so familiar with the personality of a post-truth world that I don't really need to describe it. But I'm still going to do that very briefly. The elements of a post-truth world, first of all, is that it is a world where evidence and facts have no value. It is a world where climate change can disappear, where a wall can be built between America and Mexico can be made to pay for it. It's a world where, at least in my country, Muslims can be hacked and killed basis a lie. And in your country, boats of desperate people can be turned back because they would overwhelm a lucky Australia. This is a world where their public discourse is absolutely defined and driven by an appeal to hyper-emotion and to fear-mongering. It is a world where it's not just that facts are hidden, because that's something the powerful have always tried to do, but facts just don't matter. It's a world where everything is defined by hyper-nationalism, dizzying hatred of others. A place where we can no longer have a range of emotions, a range of positions, complexity, multiple perspectives, where even the idea of individuality, which is the cornerstone of a democracy, is lost. And there are other really systemic breakdowns. There is no presumed credibility for any institution, for any public figure, for any commentator. There is an assumption in everybody that everyone else is lying, that some game is going on. And most often, there is. This, of course, has affected media and politics the most, but every profession is affected by it. The corporate world, teachers, doctors, the justice system. We are paralyzed by this inability to believe in anyone. There is an ocean of fake news around us. And then added to that, the social media and technology has created like-minded bubbles, absolutely soundproof echo chambers where we live and where we re-emphasize and reinforce the kind of simple-minded understandings and prejudices that we live with. In addition to this, there is a kind of emotional rabidity afoot in the world. There is a swing to the extreme right wing, arising out of a sense of pervasive precariousness that is sweeping across societies. Atomized individuals, disenfranchised people, moving from job to job that give no sense of meaning to them, disenfranchised not just by technology, but by income disparities, by climate change, by globalization, by conflict. The British economist Guy Standing has a word for it. He calls it the Precariat, the rise of a very dangerous class of people whose very definition is the idea of insecurity, uncertainty, fear, and anxiety. When you bring into that cocktail the long-term impacts of neoliberalism and globalization, the psychological and economic impacts of that, you really have a perfect storm. You have a landscape of terror, of dread, of anxiety, and of hate, which is trading in fear. So I come back to the question that in a world like this, what role can Gandhi play? What role can a man whose voice represented truth, who placed truth as the highest ideal of his life, what hold and what voice can a man like that have in a post-truth world? And the answer is pretty much everything. But first, as I said earlier, we will have to rescue Gandhi from the idea of epic battles. He is relevant not just in South Asia and Myanmar and the Arab Spring. He is relevant everywhere where there is an unfinished project of humanity. And that is pretty much everywhere in the globe. One of Gandhi's most profound and far-reaching political contributions, I would say inventions, was not merely nonviolence and passive resistance, but the idea of placing and privileging the individual self at the heart of all political enterprise and public life. He did not just set out to take on power or to take down power. He did not just want the British boot to shift to an Indian foot. He did not just want to change the location of power. He set out to transform the nature of power. The tool of that transformation was not an army of Mahatmas and leaders extraordinary. It was the greatest change agent of all, the ordinary, individual, moral self, people like you and people like me. At the peak of the independence movement in India, when his compatriots and co-travelers were demanding Swarajya, or self-rule, Gandhi radically altered the meaning of that demand. In Hindi, the word swa means the self, and Raj means to rule. By emphasizing the word swa and recognizing its profundity in the political landscape, Gandhi changed the entire tone and direction of the independence movement. He demanded that ordinary Indians not only fight the British with nonviolent resistance, but that they engage in a relentless scrutiny and dialogue with their own moral selves. He asked for a direct and active citizenship in the nationhood of humanity. Justice not just for oneself, but justice for all. That is where his soul force, satyagraha, stemmed from. He repeatedly demonstrated this in his own life. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this, but in 1922, when the non-cooperation movement was really at its peak, and he had galvanized the nation, fired its imagination, he called off the non-cooperation movement to everyone's dismay, because there was an incident at Chauri Chaura, a police station, where some unruly Indians burnt the police station down, and 22 policemen were killed. He called off the movement. In 1947, when India achieved its independence and a glorious new independent government was being sworn in Delhi in a tremendous ceremony, the acme of everything that we had fought for, Gandhi was walking the villages of Bihar and Bengal, trying to stem the bloody riots that had taken over. That example, that idea of the self in the political space, has been followed by many other Indians, ordinary Indians. I'll just name a few. You won't be familiar with them, but they're people like Dr. Binayak Sen, Aruna Roy, Medha Patkar. These are activists in India who have spent a lifetime moving away from their comfort zone and trying to live out that idea of the moral self in the public life. And I'm not going to tell you their stories because we don't have space for it or time for it right now. But the reason I mention them is because what we are witnessing in a post-truth world is a dehumanized world when the swa goes out of politics, when the sentient individual moral self is completely abdicated from public life, when selfish transaction dominates as the only language, and when we have opted out of that citizenship in the project of humanity and become merely consumers, when we forget to play our roles in the larger collective. In a line, this is the world we inherit when we forget to see ourselves as primary theaters of change, when we lose, to use Gandhi's words, the sovereignty of ourselves. The post-truth world, therefore, is essentially an atomized, dehumanized world where a sense of precariousness is degrading and isolating us all. The thing Gandhi teaches us is that a lot of the pushback on this lies in our hands. If we become self-aware and active citizens, as opposed to merely self-interested ones, if we bring soul force back into every sphere of our lives, small as it may be, if we recommit ourselves to the basic covenant of humanity, both as professionals and people, there would be an almost instant, steadying, stabilizing impact on the world, a sort of ripple effect. And this was Gandhi's most empowering idea, the idea that madness doesn't lie outside of us. It does not lie outside of us. It is not the battles which only the Merkels and the Putins and the Trumps and the Modis and the Turnbulls are meant to fight. The battle is us. We have to ask ourselves a simple question every day, on a daily basis. Am I passing the test of humanity? In the midst of some of the most conflagratory events in human history, as I just mentioned, that's what Gandhi was doing. He was asking himself, do I pass the humanity test? The simplicity of that is staggering. That's what gave him clarity. That's what powered his action. And that's the legacy he's left behind. That's a legacy both leaders and citizens anywhere in the world can follow. The other aspect of Gandhi that is critical to remember in 2018 is that he did not arrive a Mahatma fully baked. He was a highly contingent, flawed, faltering, intriguing, infuriating, and contradictory man who evolved through a process of hit and miss at the ideas and philosophy that he is revered for now. A few years ago, the Indian writer Arundhati Roy wrote a book called The Doctor and the Saint, which compared the political articulation of Gandhi and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, a coruscatingly brilliant Dalit scholar, the father of India's constitution, and a trenchant Gandhi adversary. In this book, Arundhati excoriated Gandhi for being a racist, casteist, empire-loving status quoist who did not speak for the blacks and believed that the caste system in India should not be dismantled. She was right. In the early years of his struggles in South Africa, when he was still a political chrysalis, Gandhi was indeed some or all of that. In fact, his book, Hind Swaraj, which carries the central tenets of his political philosophy and was written in 1908, can be a very disconcerting read. Much of it is devoted to a stinging critique of the railways, medicine, law, education, and of course, Western civilization. Gandhi believed fellow Indians did not and should not travel great distances, as it would disrupt them from their local roots. He did not believe everyone needed a formal education. He thought law and medicine, as practiced by Western science, were pernicious inventions designed to debase the morality of individuals. And Western civilization, of course, as he famously dismissed later, would be a very good idea. There is not enough time and space to examine the merits and demerits of Gandhi's views on all this. However, what makes it intrinsically problematic is that he himself benefited from all of this. He benefited from being disrupted from his conservative merchant Gujarati roots. He came from a caste that we call the Banya, extremely conservative. He benefited from his encounters with the West. He benefited from train travel, sea travel, law, and most definitely a wide and Catholic education. And through his passion, and though his passion for natural cures and mud packs is well known, I'm sure if one digs enough, one would find at some point that he even benefited from Western medicine. In fact, one of the most riveting aspects of Gandhi is to note what a perfect hybrid he was. His moral, political, and emotional universe was shaped not just by the ancient Hindu Sanatan Dharma, or by Buddha and Gita, but by Leo Tolstoy, John Ruskin, and Henry Thoreau, to name just a few influences. Amongst his closest friends and co-travelers were Germans, Americans, Jews, Christians, Gujaratis, Jains, Muslims, Tamils, and Parsis. An entire menagerie of diverse and disparate influences. And pardon me for saying this, should I say a whole boatload of it. Both these facets of Gandhi, the contingent nature of his politics and the hybrid nature of his imaginative landscape, have an invaluable significance for the post-truth world in which we live. The point is, Gandhi evolved. In the world we inhabit today, there is no space for the contingent. Back in Gandhi's day, when people and adversaries criticized him, he went right ahead and printed their criticism next to his own writing. Out of the intellectual and often personal, even fiery sparring that ensued, new ideas were born, new horizons were breached. Today, we want people and leaders and miracles to arrive perfectly packaged, bar-coded exactly the way we want them to be. We freeze-frame them and ourselves at the first moment of a public interface. And if we don't like what we see, we stone. Part of the frenzy of this post-truth world is the instantaneous moment. There can be no disagreement, only denunciation. There is no idea of an action in process. There is only perfect arrival. Else, it is malified. This is the dehumanization project both the left and the right and the wide center in between are guilty of. The refusal to dialogue, the refusal for compassion, the refusal to allow ourselves and others to evolve. In a foreword to a reprint edition of the Hind Swaraj in 1933, Gandhi wrote, and I quote, "I would like to say to the diligent reader of my writings and to others who are interested in them, that I am not at all concerned with appearing to be consistent. In my search after truth, I have discarded many ideas and learnt new things. Old as I am in age, I have no feeling that I have ceased to grow inwardly, or that my growth will stop at the dissolution of my flesh. What I am concerned with is my readiness to obey the call of truth, my God, from moment to moment, And therefore, when anybody finds any inconsistency between any two writings of mine, if he has still faith in my sanity, he would do well to choose the later of the two on the same subject. That is a serious luxury. It is sobering to think that in the slash and burn culture of today, we would have had no Mahatma. Gandhi would have been trolled and decimated the first time he opened his mouth way back in 1908. He would have been forced to cease to grow. To cycle back briefly, therefore, to the first Gandhian idea I spoke of this evening, to place ourselves back at the center of personal and political arenas, and I mean over here political in its widest sense, in terms of how we respond to conflict, how we engage with power, how we use resources, how we engage in public discourse, how we imagine an equal world, not just for ourselves, but for others. To place ourselves back as reflective, active, self-scrutinizing citizens in political arenas, reclaiming our agency, recommitting ourselves to humanity, is the single most powerful and creative act of resistance we can effect in a post-truth world. Each of us speaking up in our corners, batting for rationality and moderation, and soon the paranoia and fear-mongering will start to roll back. History is not a fixed entity. It takes just a few people to reverse a flood. That's another lesson Gandhi left with us. So before pivoting away to other aspects of Gandhi and his ideas, there is one thing I'd like to focus on in pure tribute, and that is his prodigious practice. 70 years after his martyrdom, reading Gandhi or reading about Gandhi still electrifies one because of the sheer energy, selflessness, commitment, and scale of his engagement. He is always moving, always writing, always thinking, always acting. He is the Mahatma not just because of his ideas, but because of the infinite boundary of his doing. Year after year, dogged fight after fight, jail term after jail term, journeys, fasts, campaigns, staking his heart, his mind, and body till all of it is broken and there's nothing to give, and then still more. That is indeed how one person gets to alter the very course of mankind. In that sense, truly, he was a Mahatma. We need to demonstrate only just one atom of that commitment to the world we feel we want to inhabit. Get out there and do it. Take our practice and our agitation one notch above the emoji. And to put it bluntly, that's when we can really earn the right to pronounce on Gandhi. So no matter how we frame the lens, we're all gathered here today in homage because like a true classic, a true giant, Gandhi never actually goes out of vogue. I said a few minutes ago that his musings in the Hind Swaraj are a disconcerting read, not least because his own life's trajectory contradicted it. But the brilliance of Gandhi is that, like all truly original thinkers, he had the audacity, and I use that word, the audacity to think new, the audacity to ask questions whose answers would not be played out in his lifetime. In that sense, his ideas on education, the environment, and the economy are literally the words of a seer, spoken a century before his time. At least partially, the reason we live in a precarious, frenzied, post-truth world today is because we did not pay heed to Gandhi's words in time. But before we come to that, there's a question I posed at the beginning about what significance Gandhi can possibly have for Indians and Australians, and that is only still half answered. Yes, he was significant because we can draw lessons from him on how to universally combat the neuroses of a post-truth world. We can claim sovereignty over ourselves. We have spoken of that. But other than that, on the surface at least, it seems that we have no real big fights to fight that Gandhi can illumine. Just before I caught the flight to Australia, Aruna Roy, the activist I was telling you about, who's a Magsaysay Award winner and one of India's most foremost and tireless social activists, and who's responsible for some of India's most progressive acts and laws, the right to information and the right to education, was telling me that in a classroom in Rajasthan, which is a western state in India, just about a week ago, half the classroom refused to even accept that Gandhi was, forget significant, forget a great figure, they even refused to accept that he was a public figure of any consequence. They thought not only that he was irrelevant, they thought that he had harmed India's cause by advocating Hindu-Muslim unity with the force of his body and will. Partly, this amnesia is a product of time. Partly, it is an outcome of the kind of majoritarian political ideology that is dominant in India at this time. But the real fact is that in a world buffeted by autocratic regimes and shocking political excess, democracies can often feel a bit like sedatives. They lull one into a sense of wellness, a complacency that one is part of an enlightened, completed political project. But the truth is, democracies are often themselves precarious, contingent, and flawed. Their commitment to equality, humanness, and individual freedom, which is the very bulwark of a democracy, need constant vigilance. They need reinvigoration, repledging. Without that, countries start to lose their genius, and yet don't quite notice it. Typically, Australia and India have not thought very deeply about each other. We hold each other in a very reductive stereotype, imagining nothing binds us except cricket and curry. But there is much we can learn from one another. There is a lot that is celebratory. There is a lot that is fortunate about both Australia and India. You know, earlier the ambassador was saying about India, the fact that we live with radical diversities and we live in relative peace and harmony is a message that really the world can take from us. And Australia is, again, a fortunate country built on the idea of multiculturalism. New as that is, it is a vibrant idea. But that is not really what I want to focus on, because that is not where Gandhi becomes relevant to us. India and Australia don't just share cricket and curry. It's interesting that we commemorate a common founding day as nations, 26 January. Interestingly too, both our conceptions as nations were cleft at the moment of birth itself. For India, independence came hyphenated with the blood of partition, the birth of an Islamic nation born out of the rib of a syncretic one. Here, Australia Day is also Invasion Day, when the original founders of the land, the people of the First Nations, began to be obliterated. Decades later, in the case of Australia, centuries later, those wounds have not healed. In India, 70 years after independence, the Muslim community still remains second-class citizens. They represent 14% of our country. That's almost 180 million people, and you're just 20 million in Australia, so you can imagine the scale of the problem. For 180 million people of our country, the social and human indices are among the lowest. In just the last year, our country has been scarred by some of the most violent and medieval lynchings of Muslim men by vigilante cow protection groups. There's a particular story which happened barely a month or so ago when a migrant worker from Bengal, a Muslim worker who had gone to Rajasthan, pretty much crossing the entire breadth of the country looking for work, was hacked and burnt to death by a Hindu zealot. And this entire incident was captured on video and put on YouTube, with this man speaking with impunity of how he was killing this man because he believed that he was participating in what we call love jihad in our country. And that is itself an oxymoron. There is this idea afoot that when Muslims and Hindus marry, that love is actually a Muslim war upon the Hindu nation. And so the idea of jihad. And so here was this man filming this entire horrific incident and putting it on YouTube because he believed that there would be a wider audience and a wider empathy for that act of violence. And that's just one of them. There have been many others. But India continues, even as we celebrate what is good about it, India continues to be unmindful of many of its marginalized populations, the Dalits, which again form a massive percentage of our country. It is the people that Gandhi spoke for in the latter years of his life particularly, not so much in his years in South Africa. But the Dalits too face tremendous oppression in our country. And I'll just name one community out of the Dalits, which is the sewage workers. It has been a shock for the Indian elite, and I host this club that, that Ian spoke of called Algebra. And we brought some of these sewage workers onto the stage. And the Indian elite was shocked because they did not know that there are almost 2 million workers who clean our sewage and our latrines and our toilets. It is not mechanized, and they go into holes almost 2 stories deep to really work without any protection in places that are, I would call them the hell divers. And yet we are completely unmindful of it. It is the most brutal and inhuman practice that it is possible to live with and not do anything about. But that's the truth about India and our countries that democracies can be blind to, because democracies are like 2 continents. There is the fortunate one that people like us inhabit, and there is the other, darker continent, that those who do not have the fruits of democracy, the darker continent that they inhabit. Now, this is true of Australia as well, because in Australia, the vexed relationship with its Aboriginal people is not just a wrestling over history and a futile desire to turn back the clock. It is a daily and contemporary hemorrhage in the country's body politic. These are some really dark statistics. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people are about 17 times more likely to be involved in the justice system than their peers. The Aboriginal population just makes up 3% of Australia, and yet almost a quarter of those in prison are made up of Aboriginal people. Their struggle today is not just to remember history, but to get parity in healthcare, education, food, job opportunities. In other words, their basic recognition as human beings. The indigenous communities have a very high rate of suicide, I'm told, even among children as young as 10. And so that pretty much captures the unfinished agenda lying there. But that's not all. Australian filmmaker John Pilger says that when he started making his film on Indigenous Australia around 30 years ago, a global campaign was underway to end apartheid in South Africa. It shocked him then to discover that black incarceration in Australia was greater than that of black people in apartheid South Africa. And then, of course, more recently, Australia has been hitting international headlines for its standoff with desperate asylum seekers and the brutal conditions in Manus Island and Nauru, and that fear of being overrun. The desire to create a blind spot on this is so high that the media visa application to these islands costs $8,000. And under the Border Security Act, entrusted persons, doctors and teachers at these processing centers face 2 years in prison if they speak out about the condition there. And then, of course, closer home, even your really robust idea of multiculturalism breaks down, for instance, in situations like the recent African gang crisis in Melbourne, which lays bare the kind of prejudice that lies beneath the skin in both our countries. The point I'm making is that both India and Australia live with a very proud image of being modern, plural, robust democracies. And that image is true. But common to these is the disparate phenomena which is staring at us, the question of nationhood, security, belonging, definition of the outsider, and the latent desire for supremacy in every majority community. These are questions that Gandhi engaged with ceaselessly throughout his life. But what's routinely forgotten is that Gandhi was never just a pious catchphrase. He was endeavor, he was complexity, he was vigilance. He understood that the question of belonging can never be a simplistic one. Therefore, in his first battles for the Indian community in South Africa, and later articulating even more complex and innovative ideas of nationhood, he argued for a very intricate mix of difference and assimilation, which resonates even now, 100 years later. But the thing that he was absolutely intransigent about was that no group of people, based on caste, color, race, or religion, could be kept out. His commitment to that essential civilizing idea of humanism was absolute. And that was not fodder for political negotiation. That was truth. The other profound lesson that he arrived at was this: when you fight for the rights of the oppressed, the powerless, and the underdog, we also fight to salvage the humanity of the oppressor and the powerful. This is a reminder lesson that India and Australia both strongly need today, because we would like to live with blindness. We would like to live with myopia. But this lesson ought to be the lodestone of our societies. We have to remember that our democracies are only as robust as the fair play and compassion that we mete out to our weakest edges. Sometimes it takes the eye of an outsider to foreground facts such as this. And these are uncomfortable facts. And these are facts that we back in India play the role of an outsider as journalists to constantly foreground. But when I came here to Australia, absolutely mesmerized, and I must say in the last week I've been doubly mesmerized by the quality and vibrancy of the community here. But still, it takes the eye of an outsider to notice that Australia is a continent which is twice the size of India. And yet it has a population of 20 million people, which is only 6 million more than the entire population of one city in India. Delhi has 16 million. So just this statistic captures the scale most starkly, that India has 344 people per square kilometer. Australia has 2.6 people per square kilometer. So you can understand just how blessed you are in terms of the ratio to people, the resource to people ratio. So the magnitude of the refugee crisis, that intolerable invasion that Australia is trying to stave off, often with self-mutilating cruelty, comes to me as a bit of a surprise. Because that invasion, those asylum seekers, barely amounts to 2,000 people over the last 8 odd years. And yet, political parties have been able to whip up a frenzy around how lucky Australia is under threat of being overrun. So much so that Australia spends almost $348,000 in keeping just one person offshore in detention. And it spent $4 billion in the border security actions in just 2017. The language around the refugee crisis says everything. It speaks of irregular maritime arrivals, involuntary boat turnarounds, and offshore processing centers. Language that basically functions as a kind of blinding device against the humanness of those on the other side, and indeed the humanness within ourselves. And similarly, I could reel out other statistics. For instance, there's an ABC story which says that, speaking of that Melbourne African gang crisis, that the number of aggravated robberies by Sudanese-born Australians is only 98, compared to 540 of Australian-born offenders. And again, that there were only 45 serious assaults by Sudanese-born offenders as compared to 1,462 big assaults by Australian-born offenders up till June 2017 last year. So the question that I'm posing again and again is that why does India and Australia, fortunate as we are to be living in such robust, self-endowed democracies, why are we able to live in this atmosphere of fear-mongering and heightened emotion? And how can we turn back the flood on that? In India, there's a sociologist called Ashish Nandy who says that it is the radical diversities that keep us safe. It is because our society is made up of such difference that there is a centralizing force that brings us back into a place of stability and safety. And Amartya Sen has spoken of the danger of solitarist identities. When we define ourselves only in one term, not in terms of the glorious hybridity that created Gandhi, then we're in danger of cutting off half our humanity. So I've repeatedly been using this word humanity, of committing ourselves to the humanity project, of repledging ourselves as citizens, not just to Australia and India, but that nationhood of humanity. And I can imagine that it's triggering quite a cynical reaction in all of you. What is this idea of humanity? What is this fuddy-duddy idea, and why should it be compelling in such a complicated time? To answer that, I'd like to talk to you about a book that I'm not sure how many of you know. A man called Siddharth Mukherjee wrote a few years ago about cancer, called The Emperor of Maladies. And in that book, and very recently in another New Yorker article, Siddharth Mukherjee wrote about his father dying of cancer. And it's a very moving article where he really describes how different organs and functions of his father's body start to fall apart. The kidney, the lungs, every bit of it affected, until there's what he calls a cascade failure, a failure cascade. And then he speaks of an invisible process which actually till very recently was not even recognized, a physiological process which was discovered by the physiologist Walter Cannon, or at least given words to by Walter Cannon, which is called homeostasis. For the longest time, we believed that the human body is really a kind of conglomeration of different working parts. You know, the muscles that pull and push, the heart that pumps, the lungs that breathe, the stomach that digests, and that these are all really autonomous working parts. But now we understand that there is a central governing intelligence, a highly intricate, a highly sophisticated mechanism, a process that keeps all these functioning parts working together. And that sophisticated system, invisible, almost unidentifiable, but highly intelligent, highly crucial, is the process of homeostasis. It is what keeps things functioning. It is what keeps things working as an organism. To my mind, the idea of humanity is homeostasis. It is equivalent to the idea of homeostasis. It is not a bleeding heart luxury or the indulgent luxury of bleeding heart people. It is an economic and political idea that will keep our societies safe. This humanism is what Gandhi fought and died for. And it is what will prevent the failure cascade in our societies. We have spoken all this while about, as I said, the slightly scaled down ideas of Gandhi that make him significant in our post-truth world. Because as I said, if we only speak of passive resistance and non-violence, we would cede him to the Martin Luther Kings and Aung San Suu Kyis. What relevance is he to us? So now I'd like to talk about the final things that I think Gandhi really represents for a post-truth world. And that is, as I said earlier, the audacity of his thought. In that arena of education, environment, and economy, Gandhi was absolutely prescient. At the time in 1908 and beyond, his words seemed regressive, heretic, backward-looking. But we know today that it was almost prophetic. Not almost prophetic, prophetic. Because he was deeply, deeply suspicious of Western civilization, which he really called the 9-day wonder. He was deeply suspicious of the industrial, urban, capitalist combine that dominates our world today. And he believed that we need to live within the parameters, the natural defining parameters of nature. Again, in his kind of rough, homespun way, he came up with a very pithy phrase. He said that there is enough for man to do and for nature to provide within man's needs, but not for his greed. And so today, we are living in a world where everything that Gandhi feared has come to pass. The reason we have a post-truth world, the reason that this emotion of precariousness is sweeping through the world is because there is a kind of coming together of forces that is almost unprecedented in history. And what are those forces? Those forces are climate change, apocalyptic, catastrophic, which we can see in front of our very eyes. It is the coming together of technology, of displacement through machines, of the loss of jobs, of displacement through globalization, and then of an explosion of information in people's hands, a mixing of aspiration where everyone can see how the other lives, and yet a narrowing of opportunity and of capacity. When you put all of that together, when you put the fact that economies across the world are saturating and going boom and bust in more and more frequent cycles, then you understand just how prescient Gandhi was. Not all of his answers and solutions were really the correct ones, because he created a kind of utopia out of the idea of village life, out of living entirely with nature. And as I said, he thought law and trains and machinery and all of it was bad, almost a kind of moral depravity. That was clearly not the answer. But he was asking the crucial questions. Just last week, the New Scientist put out a story which said, can the world afford Western civilization? Just 2 days ago, 15,000 scientists, many of them who are Nobel laureates, have put out a warning that we cannot sustain the kind of unseemly consumption that we are doing within the natural parameters that nature is enforcing upon us. It is Gandhi who understood 100 years ago that economy and ecology are absolutely latched together. In fact, that the economy is a subset of the ecology. And that is where we are today. We are faced with a crisis, both Australia, India, and the world, of gargantuan proportions. When we look at the Great Barrier Reef, which is bleaching, I believe there was a terrible bleaching last year and again this year after the summer, we are looking at a natural phenomenon that is not just a nostalgic, chivalrous enterprise, but really the economic nerve center of this country. It brings in $7 billion into your economy every year. Losing the Great Barrier Reef would lose $1 billion for Australia every year, 10,000 jobs, and corals bleaching across the world would cost the Earth $1 trillion. That's just the Great Barrier Reef. We're talking about the Carmichael coal mines. Again, something which seems the preserve of others. We who are living in this air-conditioned, happy auditorium, putting on as many lights as we want, it all comes back to believing that the problem lies elsewhere, the action lies elsewhere, and giving up on that idea of the sovereignty of the self, of ourselves as actors, not just as acted upon. And to understand that the moment we individually start acting, a chain of humanism is formed. In India, we are facing such a tremendous water crisis that the wars that are coming our way are not going to be with China and Pakistan, or indeed with any of the nations of this country. It is going to be with nature and ourselves. It is not alarmism of the green shirts that the Ganga is so polluted that it is barely fit for agriculture. It is not a figment of the Greens' imagination that the aquifers, both in Pakistan and India, are drying up. In fact, 1/4 of the aquifers of the world are drying up, and that 85% of India's surface water is already unusable, and that our water table is dropping so deeply that we already have a version of water wars going on in our country. These are just throwaway figures. I'll throw a couple more. There's just a recent report come out which says that 1% of India has captured 73% of its wealth. The World Bank has told us that 1,000 football fields of forests are being destroyed every hour on the planet. So what is the skewed idea of growth, globalization, development that we're talking about? Gandhi foresaw all of this. And he was, as I said, putting out warning signals and warning questions way before anyone was really thinking about it. That is the significance of Gandhi in a post-truth world. The audacity to ask questions, to go against the tide, to understand that what you're individually feeling, you must have the courage to enunciate. Just as I was again coming down here to Australia, there was a really surprising article written by, I'm sure all of you know, you've heard of the Adanis, you would have heard of the Reliance, which is really the biggest company in India. And there is a very top corporate executive in the Reliance who has just written a piece saying that the reason India and other countries are really perched on the sense of a failure cascade is because there is a short-sighted desire to serve one's immediate goals, blinded by any long-term concern for the collective. And he says that it is the elite that is taking these decisions, unmindful of what the future holds. When a top corporate executive working for a company as large as Reliance, which pretty much epitomizes the world that one is criticizing, then you know that the time has come to take Gandhi very, very, very seriously. So the questions he asked were what we need to pose to ourselves today. And if every one of us start posing those questions, the answers will come. It may not be the answers that he enunciated, but they might be that middle path that will finally take us into safety and protect us from the kind of precarious dehumanization that we are facing today. So ladies and gentlemen, that's really the kind of thesis that I would like to put in front of you today, that Gandhi matters to us because he advocated a sovereignty of the self, not the extraordinary leaders, but the citizens. And the power lies with us to turn the course of history. Thank you very much.